What's up, fellas? I believe this is questions number 36. Thank you guys for all the questions. I like that people participate in these. It makes me feel good about myself. And as always, if you have any questions you would like my opinion on, you can either put them in the comments of this video and I will get to them in the next one, or you can just put the question in the community post that I will inevitably put up before the next questions video. Thank you guys for your participation. If you have any ideas for video formats or changes to the existing videos that I do, I'm all ears. I might not be capable of making the changes, but I'm all ears. I'm not very well versed in these things, so always looking to learn a little bit and get better at them. So please let me know if there's different ways I can present to you guys my training or my opinions that would make them more palatable to watch. Also, by popular request, I have made a Discord. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't entirely understand how Discord works and what it does. It looks to me like it's a chat. I made one. I'll put the link in the description. Feel free to join if you want. Someone's going to have to explain to me how they work at some point, but I have made one. So we're going to get into the questions. We got a lot today, so I'm going to try to move at a reasonable pace. If I didn't elaborate on your question enough and you have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'll either answer you in the comments or I can touch on it in the next one. I want to make sure that I'm conveying whatever level of information that you are looking for in your question. So the first question is, speaking of meal frequency, can you elaborate more on the importance of having more meals versus just getting the desired number of calories? So I'm going to assume when you say desired number of calories, you also mean specific macros. So we're getting our 1 gram per pound of body weight in protein. That's part of the calories. So you're like, oh, why can't I just eat that in 2 big meals? Like 1 before training, 1 after training. The first problem you run into is just that it's difficult. Most people, if they're eating what I think they should be eating in a relatively clean diet to make sure that their digestion remains good, putting down, even if you're a 160-pound guy, putting down 2 80-gram of protein meals is rather difficult. So the first thing we're looking at is just an ease of consumption, right? Especially when you get into bigger and bigger people. I eat about 310 grams of protein per day. I certainly could not do that in any less than 4 meals, and 4 is a challenge. I usually have to go 5 or 6. So first of all, we have like practical, the quantities of foods that you're going to build up to as you get bigger, you get stronger, you put on more muscle mass. The amount of food you burn through in a day is going to go up, which I think is a good thing. I've always found that the more food I'm just idly burning through per day, the stronger I am. It's difficult to eat all that food, but that usually tells me I'm in a good spot with how my body is doing as far as like not being overtrained, not being underslept, not kind of being burnt out. If I'm burning through a lot of food and my appetite is there, usually my body's in a pretty good spot, and breaking that into a lot of meals first and foremost is a logistical thing. Whether it's just the total calories that's difficult to get in decent food, or whether it's the fact that, okay, I've got a lot of protein, my protein per meal is going to be a certain amount, I don't want to rely on a ton of shakes, I need to break it up. So that would be my realistic answer. That's why most people do it. You do have a tenable argument that spacing your protein intakes, your protein feedings through the day a little bit to keep your protein synthesis elevated through a greater portion of the day, you have a reasonable argument that's a good priority. I think that can be achieved in 4 meals. I don't think that the whole like, oh, 8 meals, you got to eat every hour and a half to keep protein synthesis elevated. We're talking about a diminishing return situation, just like we are with the protein intake, right? We see noticeable benefit up to that 1 gram per pound of body weight. Maybe if someone is on PEDs or they're really trying to eke out the 1% of the progress, they could take that up to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. But that's where the diminishing returns occur. And we can probably say the same thing about our meal frequency, right? We notice, oh, we get a noticeable increase in how much some protein synthesis we're getting when we move from 1 big meal to 2 meals. And we notice a bit when we move from 2 to 3. We notice a bit when we move from 3 to 4, but it's going to fall off. And I usually find 4 for a lifter is going to be enough. Once you start getting to big quantities of food, whether it's because you can't eat it all or because you're just becoming more advanced, I find that the bump to 5 or 4 and like a pseudo meal, like a shake, becomes a kind of necessity. But I think that most of the people watching this are probably beginner, intermediate, and just moving from the normal people schedule of eating 3 times a day to 4 is just a step you need to take as a lifter. And then at some point down the line in your quest to accrue more lean body mass, you probably need to take that step to 5 feedings per day. I think going past that is personal preference. If you find it that you don't like being bogged down by big meals and you rather eat 6 pretty small ones, that's a-okay. But I would say that that bump up in meal frequency is just something that has to happen at some point, and it kind of corresponds with your level as a lifter. The next question that I got is, hey Sam, I saw your video that you like programming an extended range of motion bench press variation, usually with a neutral grip dumbbell bench or a cambered bar or a Yukon bar, for example, for someone with limited training equipment, i.e. no heavy dumbbells and no specialty bars, who benches with a pretty wide grip max arch bench. Do you think a minimal arch Larson press or a hook line bench press could fill that exercise slot? That's a great question. It's a phenomenal question. I've been in that position many times now. What I'm going to tell you is I think that those are almost different slots. As soon as I have someone who has managed to significantly reduce their range of motion in the bench press via widening their grip and via creating a big arch, at some point in their training, I want to basically train that range of motion they're taking away. So we do some kind of either just reduced arch work. I don't like just reduced arch. I usually pair that with a closer grip. So we're extending the range of motion on both ends. We're pressing to a higher point as well as we're coming down to a lower point. That way we're probably going to get a little bit better hypertrophy response from the full range of motion that we might be missing in our competition style benching. Our competition style benching in this scenario with the max width and the wide arch is a phenomenal means of displaying strength, and it's a phenomenal means of handling a lot of work, like work volume, because it's more mechanically efficient. You're not taking your shoulder joint into such extreme positions, right? So we can handle a lot of volume like that. But what is it less good at? It's great at displaying strength and it's great for allowing you to handle a big work capacity, but it's not necessarily great on the hypertrophy side of things. By reducing that range of motion, we're probably going to be getting less stimulus per rep. So at some point in a certain phase, we're probably going to want to alter a certain percentage of our bench pressing to be through this extended range of motion, so either a feet up or a Larson press, and then probably bring the grip in a little bit. And you'll notice this is commonplace among a lot of very good benchers who do utilize a big arch, especially if you look at a couple of the best Japanese benchers. If you look at their programs, first of all, it's absurd amounts of volume, absolutely insane, which is only possible through very high levels of technical efficiency, and a very big portion of that volume is done as feet up close grip bench, basically to pick up on what we're missing in our main lift. That being said, I think that extended range of motion is great for checking off the hypertrophy that we might be missing out on. But as far as, like, I'm going to say bulletproofing the pecs and training them through a little bit greater range of motion, we're not really achieving too much larger of a stretch than we would otherwise. So I don't necessarily know if it fills that the injury prevention slot is what I'm going to call it. Obviously that's a really complicated thing, and someone's going to go full pain science, barbell medicine on me and be like, there's no such thing as an injury prevention exercise, to which I say, I mean, to some capacity there is, right? Injury is predicted by exceeding tissue tolerance. We can build tissue tolerance with loaded resistance training. Thus, any resistance training is injury prevention if we're improving our tissue tolerance. So I'm more than happy to get into it. I mean, I'm happy to get into it with you guys if someone wants to do that, but getting back to what I was saying, I do like to include something where I'm taking the pec to a slightly greater stretched position. In the home gym scenario, the one that I found is the easiest way to check off this box, and it does function quite a bit like neutral grip dumbbells, is either in your rack or just getting some little handles or putting your hands up on some plates, doing a depth push-up. You can just go grab your backpack, toss some weights in it when you need to add resistance, and doing a push-up where you're going below basically where you could go to the floor. At some point, I think I drove to Walmart and I bought those little pull-up handles or push-ups handles, and those let me get a great stretch with a 45-degree grip, which is really easy on my shoulder. I was able to take it below where my chest would be, and it served the exact same function as dumbbells. And if anything, I kind of liked it a little bit more than dumbbells at that period in time. So an extended range of motion push-up is a phenomenal option for a home gym. Obviously, it's not going to be a primary motion. It's probably not going to be a secondary motion, but it's going to be a tertiary motion for you to train your pecs in the absence of these other specialty bars and equipment. Hope that helps. I think if you get those push-up handles, they're great, but you can just put your hands on plates for the time being. Definitely a very good solution in my experience. The next question is, what does it typically mean when a warm-up weight feels heavy/slow, but on video it moves lightning fast? Would you still judge the RPE based on how it feels or how it moves when there's a big discrepancy? That's a great question. I usually tell people to inform their RPE assessments using both. You don't want to go with one or the other. There are some details that are missed within a video that you can subjectively feel that it would be foolish to disregard, but also sometimes our perception isn't always that accurate. So we use the video paired with the feeling to decide our RPE. And something that can happen is when you come into a session with existing fatigue, in my experience, the degree to which that impacts your perceived difficulty is greater proportionately than it impacts the actual difficulty. So if that makes sense, if you're coming into a session underslept, the degree to which the weight feels heavier is usually going to be a little bit larger than the degree to which the weight actually moves slower. So in that regard, I mean, obviously we don't all have like a tens unit. We don't have a barbell velocity gauge where we can be super objective with it, but that's where we can look at the video and say, okay, I'm tired, so this feels hard, but objectively speaking, I'm only a little bit weaker than usual. And that's going to be how I determine that. And knowing that coming in can just be something that's helpful in informing your assessments of your RPEs. I hope that helps. Let me know if you have more questions. That's a kind of a complicated issue. Assessing RPE is definitely something that becomes really multifactorial, especially if you have a really discrete breakdown that, oh, it didn't happen, and then the next rep, that breakdown does happen. If we had gauged that on that second rep where there was no breakdown, we would have maybe a misinformed opinion of when it was going to happen. We could say it was a few reps away, but in reality, it was coming the next rep. So we have a lot of things we can look at when that would kind of skew even the video and the feeling, but I would say that would be my general rule of thumb, is to use both in reference to one another. And then also know if you are someone, I think that being realistic with yourself and identifying, hey, I'm someone who, just the way I'm wired, I tend to overshoot and I tend to underestimate my RPEs because I have maybe a little bit too much confidence in myself, or vice versa. If you're someone who tends to underestimate yourself and overrate your RPEs, which kind of the camp I fall into, knowing that bias and calibrating your assessment based on that bias, which is tough to do because nobody wants to admit that they're either sandbagging their training or chronically lying to themselves about how strong they are. But if you know that about yourself, that can be extremely helpful with making you more realistic with your RPEs. And a coach can do that, but it's even better if the lifter does it, right? Because if a coach knows someone's a chronic overshooter, they might just have a rule. They're like, whatever the RPE is, I'm just going to add 2, right? And then that's how they program for them. And that's one workaround, but ideally the athlete kind of realizes that's at least their predisposition. So the next question is thoughts / your experience with accessories for injury / overuse prevention. Doing movements the squat, bench, deadlift, and overhead press doesn't cover, like hamstring curls for knee flexion, bicep curls for elbow flexion, ab work, hip flexor work. Okay, so that's a really complicated one, right? This kind of question always makes me wish I had some really cool, nice, clean sounding rule, but I think that people who talk in these really, really nice sounding rule of like this to this ratio, or you need to do this motion, or this injury will occur. No, the specificity dictates that most people can get away if we do adequate warm-up volume, adequate frequency, we're managing our loads well, we could just do the main lifts, right? So anything that is needed is individual to the person. So I can't give these great rules, right? Because it's like, yeah, are hammer curls good for elbow health? For sure. Absolutely. Training the antagonistic musculature, just introducing some more motion, moving the synovial fluid around, just strengthening the surrounding musculature surrounding a joint. These are all good things, but there are plenty of people who will never do a curl, and they just bench and they squat and they deadlift and they never have any elbow pain. And in that scenario, doing hammer curls would just be an inefficient use of their training economy that could have been better spent on a primary mover, right? So I can't make it as this generalized rule, but these things do work. Training antagonistic musculature, training musculature through a slightly greater range of motion than is going to be necessary can be quite helpful. So like we talked about earlier with the bench press, maybe if you squat low bar to just to competition standard, doing some kind of deep hack squat, taking your knee and your hip joint through a greater range of motion. If you pull sumo, maybe doing some RDLs to develop your posterior chain through a greater range of motion than what you are normally doing. These things can be very beneficial as far as keeping you healthy, but they're not a universal. So identifying what you have problems with and then selecting those things based on your individual problems, right? Another example is a lot of people could do zero ab work and just do the main lifts, brace well, focus on their bracing on all of their warm-ups and their main sets, and never have any issues with their back at all. And that's sufficient work for whatever we want to call the core, the trunk. And other people that might be a problematic area who need to introduce more stimulus to train their trunk. Maybe they do need to have a little bit of direct ab work, whether it be hanging leg raises, GHD sit-ups, ab rollouts, planks, bird dogs, stuff like that can be introduced, absolutely. But it's kind of on a need basis. Otherwise, if we try to include every single thing that we could, if we tried to bulletproof every single part of our body, basically our training would end up being like 80% bulletproofing and 20% real training. All right, I'm back. Camera ran out of battery. But picking up where I think it cut me off, just kind of finishing up my thoughts. But yeah, I mean, introducing these things on a need basis can be very, very helpful, right? So if someone has ankle issues, including some kind of seated calf raise or regular calf raise, can be phenomenal. Someone has knee issues, including knee flexion work, or maybe greater range of motion knee work, kind of the ATG system, as far as like the ATG split squats, backward sled drags. The inclusion of these things can be great, but if we try to do this all as preventative work for every single thing, we're going to run into real issues with our training economy. Especially if you're a regular person in a school or a job, we're going to run into practical issues. We're not going to be able to do enough of the main stuff. If someone has hip issues, including a greater percentage of unilateral work can be great. If someone has back issues, including a greater amount of training volume dedicated towards training the trunk musculature can be great, right? Including a little bit more pulling volume for someone whose shoulders have issues, or including a little bit more overhead pressing volume. If someone's only benching but they've got shoulder issues, maybe including a little bit more pulling volume and a little bit more overhead pressing volume can go a long way. But we can't do all of these things at once in a practical program if someone's not committed to training 1 billion hours a day with 2-a-days and fitting this all in. And the other thing that I might include also, pardon the awkward angle, this is the only way I could keep my camera plugged in. Can't put it up on the tripod right now. The other thing I would say is, one thing I often select is for my bodybuilding motions or for my secondary motions, I do try to select a motion that's hitting whatever I missed using my technique on my primary motion. So the simple example was the wide grip big arch bencher doing some sort of secondary work with a closer grip and a reduced arch. Or on the other side of the coin, someone who doesn't have that big of an arch, who benches with a close grip like myself, might be doing something from a wider grip as my secondary, because I'm getting that stimulus already from my main motion. Because something I've talked about many times is I believe that you should be doing enough work on your main motion that we could do only that. We could leave the gym and we're going to be stronger at that motion the next week. We need to be doing that amount of work where it could stand alone, and then we use the accessories as an adjunct to that. We shouldn't be needing to rely on the accessories to drive progression. Usually that leads to someone who's relatively unskilled at the primary lifts. So with that in mind, if we're doing enough of that, we're getting the stimulus that's presented by our technique on the main exercise. We should be picking up what we miss. Trying to think of a good example. Someone who squats from a narrow stance might need to do something from a little bit wider stance as their secondary motion after doing enough work from the narrow stance. Or conversely, someone who's a low bar squatter from a wide stance might need to do like a closer stance hack squat or a closer stance squat variation as their secondary motion to pick up on the physical qualities that are missed by the technique that they choose to use on their primary motion. So I think that can also go a long way as far as preventing overuse injuries. So we're not just hammering this really redundant stimulus, even though we kind of already checked that box for the day, but it also can build up lagging qualities that wouldn't necessarily be that strong just based on how you individually perform the main lift. Kind of the same thing about like, yeah, if you pull sumo, maybe you should do some RDLs afterward to kind of train the lower back, the other muscle, like, and the hamstrings, the musculature that's maybe used a little bit less by the technique that you choose to use on your main lift. So I'm going to get into the questions from the poll. Got a lot of them. I appreciate you guys, but this one's going to be pretty long. Thank you guys for watching my videos. It means a lot to me. It really does mean a lot to me that people actually care what my opinions on these things are, so I will continue to do them. The first question is, what is your favorite accessory exercise to put in the bodybuilding slots for squat, bench, overhead press, and deadlift? So obviously that's going to depend on the individual. You know that. You're a coach. right? So it's like I'm just going to go with my favorites for myself, just with how I'm built. Generally speaking, we're going to go in order. For squat, I've just been big on the full range of motion leg press because I feel that it develops not only the quads, like maybe hammering some hack squat volume would, and more often than not, the knee extensors are the rate limiting factor within a back squat. So you could get a lot done with the hack squat, and I program it for most other people. But for myself, I found that I also need to focus on developing more or less the back of my leg, my posterior chain, my glutes, my adductors, and in that regard, a leg press is actually more like a squat for me because if I hack squat or I belt squat, it seems to be all quads. I'm getting very minimal use through the posterior chain, which is a pretty important lagging factor in my squat. So I can better build up all of the musculature associated in the squat using a leg press as I'm loading both my quads and my posterior chain a little bit more effectively. Been hammering away on the full round leg press forever, and it seemed to carry over indefinitely. So that'd be my favorite. For other people, I definitely probably favor the hack squat. I think it's just a great way to build up the musculature associated with a squat, or the really musculature that's often lagging on most people. For the bench press, I've always liked dumbbell bench press with like a 45-degree grip, so that way I can get a full stretch. I've always liked full range of motion dips for a similar reason. Because I bench with a close grip, oftentimes my shoulders and my triceps are getting a sufficient amount of work and my chest is a little bit neglected. So I will try to do something that's going to target my chest a little bit more. Recently I've started using the Yukon bar for that. I could also use a McDonald bar, a bench cambered bar, to get the same thing done. All of those things are pretty interchangeable for me, but if the dumbbells go heavy enough, my favorite's always been heavy dumbbells. Overhead press, behind the neck Smith press, just because I overhead press with a relatively narrow grip. I find that doing something from a wider grip like that in a controlled setting tends to be very, very beneficial for me. And then for the deadlift, I would have to say it's an RDL. Just develops the physical qualities that a strong deadlifter has, and it lends itself to handling more volume than dead stop pulls from the floor do. So that would definitely be that'd be my picks. The RDL is kind of interchangeably. It could be done against bands. It could be done from a deficit. It could be done to blocks. If we want to shift the emphasis more towards the upper back and the glutes, we could do a slightly reduced range of motion RDL, but I recommend most people do them either full range of motion or from a deficit, just to really fully develop the hamstrings. So those would be my favorites. Can you talk about the difference between something like a deficit deadlift and a snatch grip deadlift, whether one is a better accessory for the deadlift? So we're going to get that's a better, just depends on the person, right? Either way, we're extending the range of motion. One difference is the snatch grip deadlift. We're kind of extending the range of motion at the bottom and the top. So we're having to get down to a lower position and we're having to pull to a higher position, which is great. Challenges the upper back, which is great. Maybe there's a little bit lower degree of specificity because the skill of pulling the slack kind of is completely different or gone. The skill of how you pack your lats from your regular grip on the deadlift is kind of gone. So maybe it's great for developing the muscular associated with packing your lats, but it's not necessarily the best way to practice packing the lats. Deadlifts, kind of deficit deadlifts, are an interesting one because it largely comes down to how you execute them. So what joints are we getting that additional range of motion from? Some people are just going to bend more at the knees and the hips, in which case basically it's a deadlift with a slightly greater emphasis on the lower body. We're developing our lower body musculature for the deadlift a little bit more. Some people are going to round more at their lower back, in which case that's what we're challenging to an additional degree, and some people are going to round more at their upper back, and that's what we're challenging to some degree. More often than not, it's going to be a combination of these things, but how you get that extra range of motion is going to determine where the emphasis is being shifted, like what are we placing additional emphasis on. And I think that's, if you're someone who likes deficit deadlifts, keeping the deficit where it's still relatively similar to the thing you're trying to get good at. I'm not a big believer in big deficits, as it's just a different motor pattern at that point. So keeping it, 1 inch deficits, great, phenomenal motion, maybe 2, depending on how you're getting down to the bar, and just paying attention to where you're getting that additional range of motion from. I haven't done a ton of them in quite a while. I've become a much better deadlifter without doing any deficit deadlifts, and I've been running through a training cycle of them, and as long as I'm diligent about paying attention to where that additional range of motion is coming from, it can be a great addition for like a hypertrophy phase, just to make lighter weight more challenging. And then snatch grip deadlifts, just because of the lower specificity and that you might experience some level of technical decay You could get away with using a deficit deadlift as a primary motion, which I am right now, but I don't think that you could with a snatch grip deadlift. A long time ago, I decided I would train snatch grips as a primary motion for a training cycle, which was fun because I think I ended with like a 655, 665 snatch grip, which I would love to go beat because it was fun. It was a lot of fun. But then when I returned to regular conventional deadlifts, I was strong, but I was very unskilled. So that's kind of something I would definitely put in a secondary slot. One thing that I think a lot of people don't do is just doing RDLs from a snatch grip to get some of that stimulus, right? We're challenging our upper back with that wide grip, but we're using it on a motion that inherently has limited specificity. So if you're someone who's like, okay, well, I know I need to do RDLs, it's just kind of something I need to just chip away on with time, but I know that my upper back musculature is kind of lagging. This can kind of be a two birds, one stone type exercise. It's just to includes a little bit more variation to the RDLs. The next question is, I trained conventional deadlift only for the past 6 months. I got 175 kilograms, and then I tried sumo for fun, and I got 190 kilograms. What are your thoughts, and should I switch to sumo for now? Well, if your goal is to maximize your competitive results, it definitely would indicate that you're going to be stronger sumo. So if you are looking to compete in powerlifting anytime soon and you want to maximize your competitive result, I would certainly go with the stronger technique, because you're going to have to clean up your technique. I'm guessing if you train nothing but conventional and you went sumo, the technique was not exactly pristine. So there's a lot more progress to be made just by cleaning up the technique there. If your goal is hypertrophy focused, I might not recommend the sumo. I don't think it's all that good. I might stick with conventional if that's your primary focus, and if the goal is somewhere in between, that's just going to come down to your individual preference, to be honest. If you're trying to train for both size and strength, there's nothing wrong with the inclusion of a sumo deadlift, but I wouldn't say it's going to be the best way to get to your goals as far as the hypertrophy side of things. The next question is, how to get back on track after a deload. I don't program deloads because I'm a late novice, but I really needed it last week because I started to get elbow and shoulder discomfort. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is there's this notion out there that a deload needs to be a week long. I think this is a remnant from maybe it was a multiply era thing where you have these big guys who are in terrible shape on bunches of PEDs, moving extremely super physiological amounts of weight. So that way, that's how long it took them to decay their fatigue. It was a full training week, and we have really strong lifters who are continuing to use that practice, and maybe that's how long it takes them to decay their fatigue. But for most of us, we can only bury ourselves so bad. So if we have good habits on those days that we're resting up, and we don't be like, oh, I'm deloading this week, that means I don't have to follow my diet, I don't have to go to bed on time because my training is easy. Well, you could deload faster if you did those things. Oftentimes I'll program people a 3 or 4 day deload rather than a 7 day deload, because 7 days just seems arbitrary, and after some point we're going to experience some amount of detraining. So if your deload's short enough, you really shouldn't feel too bad coming back into the training, but a lot of people will just do things in a ramping fashion, right? So just know that you're going to take one little step back just to get reacclimated to the weights if maybe you deloaded a little bit too long on that first week back, and then ramp from there. People who use intentionally deload every 4th week, they usually, what they do is they do 3 ramping weeks, and the first week isn't that hard, second week is right around their maximum recoverable volume, third week they exceed their maximum recoverable volume, deload, rinse, repeat. So if we're just coming back from a deload that was a week long, maybe we kind of take that a little bit easier week first. So please let me know if you have more questions. Deloading is not exactly my strong suit, as I don't do it, but I think I've got a reasonable understanding of the principles and how we should be applying them. The next question is, have you ever used any hammer strength type machines? For chest, my gym is a straight incline decline hammer strength machine, and I haven't really used them too much, but I was wondering if you have any experience with them, if you find them beneficial. I think I already answered you in the comments, but just for everybody else, honestly, I have never really used them all that much. I've always used dumbbells in the exercise slot where I would be doing those, as I've felt they're just a great exercise for me. Most of the gyms I've trained at haven't had hammer strength chest presses, so I haven't really ever had the chance. I think it can be something to include at the end if you find someone, especially beginners and intermediates. There's this notion, oh, you just got to develop your triceps. Triceps are how you get a big bench, and it's kind of a remnant from when we had a bench suit to replace our pecs. Oftentimes what lower level lifters or intermediate lifters need to do most is develop their pecs. Learn how to get a stretch out of them, learn how to keep your back tight, and learn how to really utilize your pecs and develop them. So including extra chest volume in a fashion that's relatively safe and easy to prepare for, like a hammer strength chest press, as long as you're getting a good stretch. I find that's kind of the real key to developing the chest as an early level lifter, is learning how to load a stretch in a safe manner, and any exercise that lets you do so is going to be beneficial for the most part, whether it be a pec fly, a dumbbell bench, a weighted push-up, whatever it is. If we're loading our pecs in a stretch position, we're going to get a solid amount of benefit out of it. And if you can achieve that with a hammer strength machine just for some additional volume, it can go a great ways. I would certainly recommend you do it in that case. The next one is, which do you think would be the smarter way to start programming for yourself without experience in the matter? Should you try out programs / alter one that worked, or go by trial and error? Do you start by studying books? I'm clueless. I'm still progressing linearly, but I don't see people giving tips on it. Would like to know for the future, since I would prefer not to rely on a coach. So that's a very reasonable question. I don't think there's a cut and dry way to do this. People ease their way into programming for themselves in different manners. I would say that one of the simplest ways is to run a couple of pre-made programs. Find the one that makes the most sense to you. I do think that's important. Not just the one that you got the best results, but the one that the layout makes the most logical sense to you. You got good results from it, run it vanilla once or twice, and then begin fiddling with the variables, right? By choosing the one that's most logical to you, you kind of have this instant level of buy-in. You kind of have this basic understanding of the principles by running through the program vanilla, and then you can kind of alter it from there and use that program as the framework for how you individually program for yourself. That's a perfectly valid approach. I think that reading books can be helpful, but it does produce a lot of the kind of issue that seems to be really prevalent on the internet, which is guys that seem very passionate about strength training, and I talk to them and they can relay to me every basic programming principle in the books, for every advanced programming principle in the books, and all these fun facts about physiology, anatomy. Like, basically they're more or less a wealth of knowledge, but then they can't write themselves a program, and that's kind of a lack of rubber meeting the road. It's a lack of trial and error. If you read all these things and you're scared to try things because you're always chasing optimal, you end up knowing all of these things that you could relay, but then you can't put them together in a meaningful capacity in a program. Or they write this program that frankly, you look at it and you're like, wow, this is a bad program. This is just someone who hasn't really tried all of these things individually in a practical application setting, or they're rapidly changing things because they know too many different things. They do one thing for 1 week and then they decide something else is optimal. Definitely the trial and error becomes a necessary part of it. And then another thing you could do is, there's nothing wrong with good old American traditional block periodization, where you hit a couple weeks of eights. You start with some lighter eights and you do a bunch of them, and you add a little weight each week till you get to a heavy eight, and then you move on to fives and you hit a bunch of fives, and then add a little weight each week till you end with a heavy five, and then threes, and then singles, and then rinse, repeat, and tailor the amount of time you spend in each rep range. That could be a very, very simple way to introduce yourself to programming for yourself. I think that it works very well for most people. It can work indefinitely as long as you're willing to tailor those variables and frequencies to yourself. And the biggest thing is just learning to either take your hand. Basically, the big thing of learning how to program yourself is learning how to take your hands off for a while. Write yourself a plan. Don't deviate from the plan for a block or a microcycle or a mesocycle or however long you want to do it. And then you assess. Don't assess on a daily basis, or you're going to be changing things too rapidly to ever realize what actually works. I think that's the real pitfall of most people who end up trying to program for themselves, is rapid changing and never really realizing what training variables are leading to your success when it happens, because things are changing too rapidly. So learning to kind of take your hands off for periods of time is probably the most important part of learning to program for yourself. The next question is, Liftingvolt just posted a 72 kilogram teen benching 200 kilograms. Why can he bench so much at a light body weight? Did genetics play that much of a role? Yeah, genetics play absolutely a huge role. Part of this is people are really thrown off by teen does X, Y, or Z lift, because they don't seem to understand that training age, assuming we're post-puberty, training age has a lot more to do with strength than absolute age, right? If someone started training at 12 years old and they are now 17, and they've been taking it seriously, which some people do starting from an early age. They have 5 years of serious training under their belt. Of course they're going to be stronger than a 25-year-old who's in their first year of training. They've accumulated 5 years of serious training. Maybe they've been starting to ramp up their food through that time. Of course they're stronger, right? Training age has a huge impact on these things, right? So there's a good chance this guy has been exercising or resistance training for quite a while. Obviously that's still a freakish result. He's got phenomenal genetics. I'm not going to be a fool and tell you otherwise, but I went and watched the video. He's got phenomenal technique, got a good arch, got a good wide grip. I'm going to go on a limb and guess he's got a pretty sizable training history. I'm sure he took it very seriously within that time. It was a very high priority in his life, as many young people are able to do. Obviously genetics are huge, but there's a lot of other variables that go into that really, I think, throw people off in perceiving these lifts done at a young age, right? I think I've got a unique insight to this because Max is one of the strongest teenagers to ever live, and people are like, oh, how does he do that? Well, first of all, he's 300 pounds. He's just a big guy. I don't think people understand how different strength standards are when you have that big of a frame. They're like, oh, well, this number can't be done naturally. I'm like, it's barely a double body weight squat. What the hell do you mean it can't be done naturally? You're just saying this would be impossible for someone your size at 190 pounds, right? So there's a lot of, obviously that doesn't apply to this 72 kilogram guy, but I think there's a lot of things that do skew people's perception because Max has accumulated a good, like 7-year training history now, and he's been taking it seriously the whole time. And I can say that with honesty because I've been overseeing it and programming it, and he's been training with the primary goal of strength for 7 years. So when people are like, how is this possible? I'm going to quit. I'm 30 and haven't done this. I'm like, well, you've been training for less than 7 years. You haven't been training as long as him. I don't know what to tell you. There's this perception that everybody starts at like 16, so that any lift done as a teenager is insanely impressive, but a lot of people do start earlier than that. Even John Hack says he started lifting at 12. But yeah, the guy's a freak. He's got great genetics. Genetics matter a lot. I really don't want to make myself look like a fool and tell you that's not the case. But there's a lot of things that go into that. Do you have a preferred deadlift variation to improve strength off the floor? I find the first few inches of the pull to be the hardest part. Okay, so first of all, just continuing to develop your squat will go a long way. Just having a strong squat develops all the musculature associated with breaking the deadlift off the ground in pretty reasonable proportions to one another. And if you look at really big squatters who have a terrible deadlift, they do not miss off the floor. They can break a lot of weight off the floor. That isn't their issue. So just developing the squat can go a long way. Improving your technical proficiency. A lot of people who miss off the floor because they're not getting tight enough. Learning to really, really commit to a pull can go a long way. And then as someone suggested, 2 things that I have found very helpful is deadlifts with a pause directly off the floor, so we're exposing our body to that most difficult position for a greater duration of time, or deadlifts off a small deficit, paused where the floor would normally be, again, to develop more strength in that starting position. These 2 things can be very helpful, especially if done in conjunction with developing your squat more and more. Front squats can also be relatively helpful for that goal, but a lot of it just comes down to getting tighter off the floor and spending more time in a loaded position right off the floor. The next one is how to build adductor strength and flexibility for sumo. So squatting deep or deep squat variations with your toes turned out is a great way to build up strength in a lengthened adductor position. One of the only variations that Yuri Belkin does on a week-to-week basis is high bar squats with his toes out. That's a variation that he's utilized for a long time to develop both his squat and his deadlift and build strength in a lengthened adductor position. I think you'd be surprised if you're someone who squats with your toes straight forward, which most people with weak adductors do, how much more challenging it is to turn your toes out, drive the knees out a little bit more, and do like a 45-degree toe angle squat. Those can be quite helpful. Doing that in a more controlled setting can be helpful, like a belt squat. That's a big one. Doing Cossack squats on a weekly or daily basis can go a long way. And then the most useful one, in my experience, is doing deadlifts with a controlled negative. I wouldn't Maybe early on you could play around with touch and go just so that way you're keep maintaining that open hip position for time. But basically just controlling your negatives and spending a lot of time under tension in those midway points that you wouldn't necessarily get by dropping each pull from the top. So I think that would be the last one. And then basically you select your stance width proportionate to the strength in your hips. So starting out with a relatively narrow sumo stance because you can't really get into anything wider, doing controlled reps building the strength in the abductors, lengthening the adductors, building strength there. And then bringing that stance out a little bit, doing more controlled reps there. I think that's probably the simplest way to go about doing it, in conjunction with some deep squatting with a turned out toe. Doing a little bit of static stretching, just the side splits can honestly be kind of helpful, but you don't want to overstretch. That can cause some nerve issues if you really over push it. And also you really want to make sure that you're developing strength and stability in those new ranges of motion that you're gaining from the static stretching. And then building the conventional lockout strength, more often than not, missing at lockout in the conventional deadlift has nothing to do with your glute strength. It's not that you can't get your hips through. It's the fact that you fudged your position off the floor to get the bar moving. And then you're having to undo that fudging at the top, which is quite difficult. So any rounding we have in the lumbar or thoracic spine, we're going to have to undo at the top. And the easiest way to get better at this is to avoid being in that situation in the first place. It's the reason a lot of people probably shouldn't be doing block pulls and rack pulls to strengthen lockout, is because, hey, you're now just skipping the part of lift that you're fudging historically. A rack pull can have its place if it's used as a bodybuilding motion to address this problem. So, okay, we're developing our upper and mid back musculature, which then we could use and practice some good pulls off the floor, and we might be able to maintain our position better because we have a stronger mid back. That might work, but to say that we're overloading the lockout from a completely different position doesn't entirely make sense. So basically what I would usually recommend that people do who are missing at lockout is pauses directly off the floor, as you suggested for the other guy, maybe small deficit pauses directly off the floor, and really develop our ability to maintain our spinal position as we break the weight off the floor, and then an increase in upper back volume, mostly lats, getting really good at packing our lats as we break the floor. It'll smooth out the lockout. Lockout's always been the hardest part of my deadlift as a reasonably strong squatter. So basically we have two kind of goals, right? We're going to build up the musculature associated with tightness off the floor, which is like our core and our upper back. And then we're going to go apply that to the deadlift by, practicing good technique. And it's easier to practice good technique and contract muscles that are bigger. It's just like how if you ask someone who's very new to lifting to flare their lats, they can't. And then they train their lats for a little bit and suddenly they can flex the muscle. You need a certain amount of mass there to really connect well with a muscle. So building up the upper back can make it easier to have a technically proficient deadlift, at least in my experience. So that's all the questions. Thank you for watching my video.